Welcome to a new video on YouTube channel of tutorialspedia.com. In this video, I'm going to cover TIBCO BusinessWorks 6 HTTP security, and we are going to see and demonstrate that how we can use basic authentication and basic credential mapping security policies. This video is part of a series of BW6 related video tutorials where I'm covering different topics related to BW6. Let's look at the topics that we are going to demonstrate and cover in this video tutorial. We will first have an overview at a high level what exactly basic authentication and basic credential mapping policies are and why they are used and what's the purpose of using these security policies. And then there will be a demonstration where I will create a TIBCO BW6 project in Business Studio, and I will implement client and server processes using basic authentication and basic credential mapping policies. So at a high level, if we talk about what exactly basic authentication and basic credential mapping policies are, basically these policies are used for the HTTP security, where we implement these policies to make sure that all the requests which are entertained by the server in case of basic authentication are secured with the basic authentication, and the client needs to pass username and password in order to access the resources or access the services. So in this case, in TIBCO BusinessWorks 6, BW6 provides quite convenient and useful tooling, and it provides different options to configure the basic authentication, and this is applied at the server level. So at the server level, when we will be creating a process with the HTTP receiver as the process starter, we will configure and implement basic authentication policy. And for this purpose, we will be using XML based authentication provider, and the username and password will be in the XML files. And then next we will see that how we can use basic credential mapping policies, which is used to map the username and password, which is used to basically map username and password credentials from the client side when the request is passed to the server. So we will now demonstrate both of these policies, and we will see that how these policies help us to secure our HTTP endpoint based processes or services in our TIBCO BusinessWorks integration projects. So I'm going to create a new project in Business Studio. So I will choose new and I will choose BusinessWorks project. So once you choose the project, you will have to select from the BusinessWorks, and we will create BusinessWorks application, and I'll click on next, and I'm going to give it a name. Let's name it as HTTP security demo, and we are going to select this option, create application module. So it's going to create the module as well. As you know that an application basically consists of one application module, and it can have 0 or more shared module. So in our case, we are going to create a project, or we are going to create an application which will have only one application module. So in the next step, we are not going to make any changes for the assets. We will keep the names of all the folders as is, and we will just click next and we will finish. So once we click on finish, we can see in the project explorer that a project has been created. And once the project has been created, then we will proceed with our subsequent steps of creating the policies and then configuring policies and binding it to the HTTP receiver. So once you create a project, by default with the same name, there is a process that gets created. The name of the module is same. The package name is same, HTTP security demo, which is the name of the project as well. And then inside there is a process.bw. So this is a BusinessWorks process which gets created automatically. So in this process, what we will do is that we will create, we will use HTTP receiver as the process starter, and then we will configure our HTTP connection so that it receives the request on some specific host and port. So here we are going to just create a new HTTP connection. So when you click on this binocular, and then since there is no HTTP connection already available, so we are going to choose this option of create shared resource. So once I click on this create shared resource, here you can name it as something like it's by default its name is HTTP connector resource. If you want to change it, you can, but let's keep it as is and just click on finish. Now we need to change the host and port. So I'll just click on this arrow and it will open the edit option for this HTTP connection that we just created. So for the connection in the basic configurations, if you want to specify host name or port or whatever you want, you can specify over here. And right now it's pointing to a module property, but if you want, you can use a literal value as well. So in our case, let's try to use a literal value hard code. But in actual cases, of course, you will use a global property, that's a module property, so that you can change it whenever you are deploying into the different environments. For now, let's keep it hard coded a local host, and the port I'm going to use 8089. You can use any of the available ports. We are not going to make any other changes for the connection. So let's go back to the process. And in the process now, in this case, we are not going to make any other changes like in the context path. If you want to make, you can always, and parameters, etc. So we will keep it as simple as possible because the purpose is to demonstrate the security features and not the other basics. Now, once we receive a request, what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to add a log activity. So I will go to general activities and I will choose log. So in this log, I'm not going to make anything fancy. I'm just going to log the current date and time. So I'll go to the input, and in the message, I'm going to write current dash date time. So this is the function which returns current date and time. So this is something that we are going to log, and then I'm going to add the response activity. So I'll go again to HTTP palette, and from here I'm going to select this send HTTP response. So let's add a transition, and in this HTTP response, what I'm going to do is that in the general tab, I'm going to select reply for, and here I will choose HTTP receiver, and then nothing else. Just go to the input, and here I'm going to add something in the ASCII content. So here I will concatenate something. I will write concat response time response add. So I'm going to just add current date and time, current dash date time. So we will have to use string function. So by once I will save it, it will give an error. So you can write xst colon string. Otherwise, if you just fix it, it will be working fine. Okay, so I will just use this option to fix the typecasting, and you can see xst colon string has been added, and now there is no error here. So very simple process, but what we have done now is just a simple HTTP based process which will receive a request and it will just log and the current date and time and it will send a response. But what we want is that we want to secure this one. So in order to secure, what we will do is that for HTTP receiver, we will go to this policy tab, and here you can see there is no policy. So I'm going to click on this plus button which says add policy to the activity. So once you click here, you can see there is no policy. So for that purpose, you can directly create policy from here as well. But another option that you can use is that you just go to the policies folder, right click, and then you can choose new and you can add a policy. So here, once you click on new policy, you can see that we have all the options. If we have HTTP based policies, we have SOAP policies. So in this tutorial, we are covering HTTP security. So we will configure first basic authentication. So here you can make changes to the name, package or policy folder if you want to make any change. So basic credentials, even some explanation is here that applying this policy ensures that the users cannot access your application unless their credentials are verified. Basic authentication can be enforced on any of the following entities. So SOAP or HTTP service binding, REST service binding, HTTP receiver, or wait for HTTP. For now, in this case, we are going to use it for HTTP receiver. And now in the policy defaults, we have multiple options, and we will use this basic option of user and password in workspace XML file. You can have this in the XML file in your file system, or you can use LDAP based username and password authentication, and you can use the last option of empty policy without any defaults. But our case, we are going to use this username and password. And then what we are going to do is that we will just click, and here it shows some more details that basic authentication policy with username and password in workspace XML file, which is the one that we have selected as default option, will perform the following. So it's going to create an XML authentication shared resource, and it's going to create an XML file which will be referenced from this authentication shared resource, and that XML file will be containing username and passwords in the plain text. Of course, in the real scenarios, you will be having this in the encrypted format, but that's not going what we are going to cover in this tutorial. So we will, for the sake of simplicity, we will be using plain text XML file. So you will just click finish and you will see that some resources will get created. Okay, so now we can see that a policy has been added. And if you go to the resources now, in the resources, you can see that we have XML file that has been created. We can see that authentication provider has been created, and we can see that the previously created HTTP connection resource is already there. So two new things have been created. So if you see this basic authentication provider, this one is referring to this XML file. So XML file resource, because we are using XML file based authentication, so it is referring to the file that has been created. So if we go to that file, okay, so I'm just opening the file, and you can see in the file, this XML users.xml file, that it is containing some sample users which we can use for this authentication. So for now, if you see, we have John, Alex, these are the two users, and we have some groupings. So let's change it to something else. So John has a password as password. So second user, I'm going to change it to Tutorialspedia, and password I'm going to use uh, Tutorialspedia. So we will use same username and password. So we will now use this basic authentication for our HTTP security for HTTP receiver. So we have created the file, we have created the authentication resource, and we have the policy already there. So now if we go back to the process, and in the HTTP receiver, if we go to the policy tab, here we will just click on the plus button, and now you can see that HTTP security which we just created has been is being shown over here. So we are just going to select it. So once you select it, now what happens is that this basic authentication policy has been mapped to this HTTP receiver. So any request that comes to this HTTP receiver must contain the basic authentication username and password. So if these credentials are not correctly provided, the request is gonna fail. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to start or I'm going to run this process in the embedded runtime, and then we will hit the service from the client. We can use any client, like we can use typical browser, we can use SOAP UI, or we can use Postman or something else. So let's run this project. So I will run this BusinessWorks application. So till the time this gets loaded and starts running, I will prepare the client side from a tool like Postman. We can see that the project is now running. This service is running in our Business Studio, and we can see here that it started successfully. Now we can go to the client side and we can try to hit the service. So I'm going to use Postman for this purpose. So in the Postman, I have already put localhost colon 8089 with the HTTP protocol. And just now, for the sake of demonstrating, I'm going to hit the service without providing any credentials. And I will be expecting that I should get an error. So once I click on send, we can see that we got an error 401 unauthorized. And if we go to our server, we can see that it says username not available for authentication. So this is because of the HTTP security policy that we have configured. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to pass username and password from the client side. So here I'm going to choose for the authentication basic auth, and the username I'm going to choose is Tutorialspedia, and same password which we have provided in our XML file. And now if I try to send the request, if username and password is correct, we can see that we got a response. So we got a response, and then it shows us the date and time. So this means that we have successfully consumed our service, or we have successfully invoked our service with the HTTP receiver. And now if I try to give a wrong username and password, so let me just add something next to the username. So now username is incorrect, and we can see that the response we have received is 401 unauthorized. So this is how we configure HTTP security policy with basic authentication. And using that, we ensure that whenever clients are accessing our HTTP receiver based service, they always provide correct username and password. So now we are moving to the next step, where we are going to see how we can use basic credential mapping policy, which is to be applied on the client side on the send HTTP request. We will see that how we can enforce the validation for the basic credential with the credential mapping from the client side. So I'm going to create a new policy. I'll go to policies, I'll choose new, and I'm going to add a new policy. So in this case, we are going to use this basic credential mapping. You can read the details there that it states. Applying this policy ensures that credentials in the consumer request are validated once and propagated across the domain. Basic credential mapping can be enforced on one of any of the following entities. So it says if you can use it for send HTTP request, or you can use it for invoke REST API. So we are going to use HTTP request. So we will configure this policy for HTTP request activity. In the policy default, there are multiple options, but without going into the details of what exactly each of these policy default is, we are going to use fixed credentials. And it's going to create a new identity provider for this credential mapping policy. I'll just click finish, and you can see that a new policy has been added, and also a new basic credential mapping provider has also been added. So here in the basic credential mapping provider, in the identity provider, you have to specify username and password. So we will be using same similar username and password which we use for the server, so that we can use the same server. So in our case, the username and password was tutorialspedia. So I will use same, but you can use any of those which are available in your XML file. Okay. Right. So now once we have configured this, now what we are going to do is that we are going to create a new process, which will be a client process. So I'll choose new, and I'll choose BusinessWorks process. Let's name it as client process, and we will use it as empty process and finish. Now in this process, we will run this process once. So we will use a timer. So I will go to basic add activities, general activities, and I'll choose a timer. And in this timer, we will configure it to run only once, so that we are able to demonstrate this. And then I'm going to use HTTP from the HTTP palette. I will use this send HTTP request activity. Let's do the transition. And in this send HTTP request, I'm going to so I'm going to select a new shared resource, which is HTTP client resource. So HTTP client resource, there is already client resource added. So I'm not going to use that. I'm going to create a new shared resource so that I can demonstrate as well how this shared resource is used. So basic cred HTTP client resource. So this is the name I'm giving it. You can name it anything, and I'll just finish. Okay. So now, if I go to this shared resource which I just created, I need to configure something here. So the first thing I need to configure is that what is the host and port which we want. So we want to configure this client for a server which is listening on 8089 on localhost. So we will do that. Okay. So once we do that, after that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to the client process, and here I'm going to configure the policy. For this send HTTP request, in the policy tab, I'm going to select the policy by clicking on this plus button, and the policy which we already created, I'm going to select that. So now you can see that it got some error. The reason is that if we go to our client resource, we need to make sure that in the implementation library, we are selecting this Apache HTTP component. So I'll just select this, and I'll go back to the client. Now there is no error. And just let's add another logger after this. And this simple logger will just log something so that we can see. And I'm going to add a transition, and in this logger I'm going to just hard code some message. Instead of hard coding a message, I'm just going to log the response that we will receive from the server. So ASCII content I'm going to map over here. So pretty simple. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to run both client and server, and I am expecting that the client request should go to the server, and since server is using basic credential, so that will be validating. And since on the client side we already configured the basic credential mapping policy, so based on that mapping policy, the credentials should be mapped and validated, and then this end-to-end testing of client and server should work. So let's run this process. Okay, going to run this BusinessWorks application, and then we will see from the logs how things move. Okay, so we can see that we got this that started the process. Then there is a log on the server side. This logging, because on the server side we are logging only the time, and then once it sends back a response on the client side, we can see that we have this log at the client side which says response at this whatever the time it is, because this is the log from the client side. So basically what happened is that both client and servers worked successfully based on the provided username and password. So if you try to change anything and make any mistake in the client side in the identity by providing wrong username and password, you will see that you will get an error because the credential validation will not work. So this is how you used basic credential on the server side and basic credential mapping on the client side. So that's it from this tutorial. I hope that the information that I conveyed in this video is helpful for you. If you want to know further about how the policies work, you can always go to the official TIBCO documentation, and you can always refer to my channel Tutorialpedia as well as tutorialpedia.com, where I have plenty of different tutorials related to TIBCO BW as well as other integration technologies. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the like button. Thank you.